Hey y'all, welcome to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Samantha Leighanne and I talk about books. This is another episode of the King Chronicles. Today we are going to be discussing Firestarter. Just again, as a disclaimer, I am not the authority on these works. I just really enjoy Stephen King's writing and I enjoy the process of going through and making these videos. I make these for me, not for anyone else. I say as I post it to the internet because I enjoy doing it. As such, again, I am not an authority, so if I get something wrong, you can politely correct me in the comments below. Just don't get nasty about it. Also, obviously this is a video where we are going to be deep diving into this work, so as such, spoilers ahead. If you have not read this book, then you might not want to watch this video because we're going to talk about a lot of stuff today. As a reminder, the formatting of these videos, we talk about some fun facts, we talk about how I felt about the book, talk about some characters, talk about some themes, and any connections to King's previously published works. That's your reminder. Without further ado, let's just go ahead and jump right into this. Firestarter was published in September of 1980. When we talk about genre, I would call this more of a thriller with like some science fiction type elements to it. Definitely not anything in the realm of supernatural, definitely not horror. Once again, like we saw in the last episode with the Dead Zone, we are definitely kind of coming out of that horror genre. So I have a lot more fun facts about this one than I did about the Dead Zone, so that's pretty cool. You know, just as a general thing, his publishing deal that he had with New American Library, I believe it was really panning out for him at this point. So just to kind of give you some numbers on how changing publishers like really impacted King. When The Stand came out in hardcover and they published that, they only sold about 50,000 copies, Doubleday did. And then whenever he switched over to New American Library, they sold 175,000 copies of The Dead Zone in hardcover. And then after The Dead Zone Firestarter, they sold 280,000 copies in hardcover. So, you know, that's kind of a big deal. One of the reasons for this is because Doubleday was very much afraid that King was going to be like, not typecasted. Well, yeah, I mean, I guess kind of typecasted. He would be typed as a horror novelist. And honestly, I do feel like that's true. I think that he is a name that is very synonymous with horror even to this day. But I think that the people that think that he only writes horror are the people that don't read his books regularly. I, for one, feel like he's pretty overrated as a horror author. He has so much more to his body of work. So, you know, like, don't come after me for that. But I feel like it's true because, again, we have books like Firestarter, books like Dead Zone, 11/22/63, like a bunch of other books, you know, within the body that are not horror. And I think that New American Library really saw the potential in that. And, you know, it ended up obviously being great for him. Talking about horror, King did say in an interview one time that he sees himself as a writer of suspense, and that he sees horror as one room in a much larger house, and that is the house of suspense. And I do feel like that makes a lot of sense, especially whenever you talk about all the different subgenres of horror as well. He also stated in a later interview that the only books of his that he considered pure unadulterated horror were Salem's Lot, The Shining, and Christine as well. And the reason for that being is because they offer no real like explanation for the events that occur. When you're talking about Carrie and the Dead Zone and Firestarter, you know, those have kind of like that more like science fiction element to it, you know, so you can kind of explain some of the occurrences to those versus, you know, the other ones that I previously mentioned. There's not really an explanation. He originally started this book in 1976, but he kind of abandoned the project at one point because it was reminding him too much of Carrie, and he came back to it later. And I can see that parallel in a way. And then whenever we look at King's personal life at this particular point, it was actually a pretty dark period in his life. He was a raging alcoholic and had actually just started doing coke as well. So this is kind of the beginning of that period of his life. Those are some fun facts about the novel. So now we're going to talk about how I felt about it. I feel like this book, we're really building on the progress that we've made in the Dead Zone, especially when it comes to characterization and character development and things like that. This book interests me for a couple of different reasons. This book takes the progress that we made in the dead zone with the character development, and, you know, that was a very slow-paced plot. Firestarter really amps up that plot. There's a lot going on, a lot of different things happening. You know, it's really kind of a wild ride from start to finish. And so, you know, he really took those two elements and put them together for this particular book. You know, we have one of the reoccurring themes, you know, characters that are distrustful of the government. That is a thing that we have seen time and time again in King's work. You know, this is really also one of the most science fiction-y books of his that we've seen up until this point. You know, you've got you know, government testing, you know, latent psychic powers due to the government testing and that kind of thing. The plot itself is pretty linear, honestly, and so it really keeps everything moving, which is nice because it's not a super long novel, but it does have a little bit of length to it. So, you know, it's one point A to point B to point C, and so I think that, you know, with it being so linear and you're not all over the place, it makes it a little bit more impactful that way. And I think the other thing that keeps it engaging is, again, that character development, especially with Charlie. Charlie is modeled after King's own daughter, which is only a little weird seeing as we talk a lot in this book about the sexual awakening of Charlie. So, you know, that's a thing that's a little weird. And while the telekinetic powers aren't really anything new, this whole like sexual awakening thing kind of is. We saw the beginnings of that in Carrie, but it's really more explored in this particular work. There's no actual sex, which is good considering this is a book about a child, but to see Charlie's development, you know, it is a father-daughter story. You know, from the beginning, she is very reliant on her father for obvious reasons, but as she continues to go on through the book, and as she continues to develop as a character, we see her becoming less and less reliant and really coming more into her own. You know, and I think by the end of this book, we have an entirely different character than we did at the beginning. You know, which is a good thing. I kind of feel like this book is a little underrated. I don't really see a whole lot of people talking about it, but I think that it's a really good example of his earlier work, especially coming off of the Dead Zone, which is so character driven and relies so heavily on character development. And here we kind of see that plot driven action and the character driven action really like coming together. So I think it's a really good example of his early work, but I just don't see a lot of people talking about it. I will say there's a couple of points in this book. It is very difficult to read a older work through a modern lens. As an example, this book was published in 1980. So, you know, you're looking at 30, almost 40 years ago, this book was published, right? So there is a good little bit, one of the characters in this particular book is Native American. We'll talk about him. And there's just some terrible racist shit that is said. Once again, this is 40 years ago. So I can point that out. I can point out the fact that that's really fucking shitty, but I can't say that King is a bad writer because he used those things because it was 40 years ago, right? Now, if he wrote that book today and included that today, then we would have a problem. We would definitely have something to talk about. So I'm gonna point out that that's a thing, that there's some real like ugly racist shit in there, and that happens in several of his books through his earlier work. I'm not gonna cancel it, you know, because of that. Okay, so let's go into themes. Obviously the first theme being Charlie's sexual awakening, right? Because I've talked about that a couple times. I already kind of touched on this, you know, obviously sex and fire kind of go hand in hand in this book. You know, like when we talk about sex, you know, like burning desire or, you know, like that type of thing. So sex and fire kind of go together. So I guess it really makes sense to use like pyrokinesis, you know, as a device in this book when talking about her sexual awakening. They also refer to fire starting as like the bad thing, right? And it's interesting to me that they call it that because so often, you know, when we talk about sex, it's the bad thing, you shouldn't do it, you know, don't have sex or you'll get pregnant and die, you know, so I feel like there's a very, very obvious parallel there. There's also this whole speech from a character, and I can't remember what his name is. It's like, I'm so bad at this. I can't remember his name. And I don't have it written down, but he goes through this whole speech about Charlie and her power. It's very obviously, very thinly veiled about her sexuality and the power that she has in her sexuality as a woman. You know, as Charlie continues to grow and really continues to learn to control her power, she feels stronger and eventually, you know, overpowers her captors, which I think, speaking as a woman, really owning your sexuality and having a feeling of ownership over your body and that aspect of it is a very powerful feeling. So, you know, and all of this culminates in this image of this burning barn, you know, while her father is dying and there's this massacre happening and stuff. So another theme in this is surrogate father, and this is another theme that pops up a lot in King's work. You know, you want to talk about Ben Mears to Mark Petrie in Salem's Lot, or like Halloran in The Shining. Both of them come out as good guys in their books. And then as Charlie goes through, you know, obviously she has Andy, her actual father, and they become disconnected. And then she kind of has a surrogate father in Rainbird, who, you know, we know how that turns out. And their relationship is like vaguely sexual at first. It's very strained. Rainbird really becomes like a surrogate father to her through manipulation. And then both her father and Rainbird tell her that they love her like before their deaths. And then Rainbird actually attempts to kill her. And so it's just very strange for that to like be a surrogate father figure. But those are really the two biggest themes in this particular book. And then of course, we come to characters. Once again, I don't feel like, much like the Dead Zone, I just don't feel like there's a real need to go through and rehash characters. You know, I think that if I spent any time going over characters, I would just be rehashing things that I've already said, and so I don't really feel like there's a point in that. I don't want to like bore you to death, so we're just going to skip past that. And there's a couple of connections in this. There's not a ton, but there's a few. At one point, Charlie is described as gunslinger, so again, we have precursor to that. One of the names that is used in this, and I said at the beginning that we're going through and we're talking about King's published works up until this point, but this is the first time that we see this name used. Patrick Hockstetter is a character in this book. Now, this is not the same person. You know, this is an entirely different character, but that is a name that he recycles, reuses in another book. So, and then the shop is the main like government facility that's going through and completing these tests. These are the people that are looking for Charlie and Andy. This is a name that is mentioned in the complete and uncut edition of The Stand, which was published in, I believe, 1990. I could be wrong about that. I cannot recall. And then that is another name that recurs through some of his later works, but we won't go into specifics there. All right, so that is all I have to talk about for Firestarter. How do you feel about this book? Once again, I'm not the authority. I probably missed some stuff. Don't come at me for it. But yeah, so tell me how you feel about it. You can comment down below, let me know. I'm not gonna say keep it spoiler free because we just talked about a lot of spoilers. So if you wanna talk about spoilers, you go right ahead. You can also contact me on Goodreads, Twitter, and Instagram. All of my social media links can be found in the down bar below. As always, if you like what you see and you wanna see more, make sure you click thumbs up or hit subscribe if you have not already. If you wanna be notified about my latest videos since I'm uploading again, you can click the bell to stay in the loop. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all next time. Bye.